So that is a blessing for teachers. And this is actually the oldest cottage in the Jewish teaching. And so now there are many different cottages that are used throughout a service, but this is the oldest version. All the other cottages came in. And so it's the blessing for someone who teaches or imparts learning to someone else. And it's the idea that learning is both circular and a web. That when you teach a student, that student always teaches the teacher. The teacher learns something in the process. But hopefully that student will then go on and teach other people. The student will become the teacher, and that learning will continue to pass on and pass on and pass on. And so this web of knowledge and learning is around surrounding all of us. Anytime that we share whatever our truth is, that truth that you're sharing with other people is called Torah. And so it's a blessing for studying.
One last detail that's kind of in honor of Pride Month. Debbie Friedman is probably the greatest liturgist in the last 50 years in the Jewish world. She was a lesbian, and just wanted to honor her memory. She passed away 10 or so years ago. So it's also a way of honoring her and all those who found her. So you're welcome to join in once we do.
Yeah, so the first verses we sing, and then the next verses. For our teachers and their students, and for the students of their students, we ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. And for those who study Torah, here and everywhere, may they be blessed with all they need, and let us say Amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say Amen. We ask for peace and loving kindness, and let us say
And then we have one more thing, changes of the rule prayer. This is a traditional prayer that's used in Jewish context before Torah study or any kind of engagement with learning. So I thank you for joining with me.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with the words of the Torah.
So now I'll hand it off to Ty. So,
Before I get into everything I have to say, I did want to say I'm very grateful to you after such a long time. And I'm also really happy to see that, we're all still the same, and really happy. So, hello, my name is Branum, and I'm here to talk about my education of Shoah. Support. Along the way, I also want to touch on some connections to the story of the show, especially on the 27th resolution of Israel and Palestine. Starts off with a couple of quotes from the resolution prepared, and I would like to ask if there would be some volunteers in our audience that would like to laugh.
and real quick, I'll try to recommend this to the whole screen. So I need to
Some of us were
Very top right, James. Slideshow.
by the way, I want to mention nope, very good.
Oh no, it's already shared. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we're good.
Anyone here like to read this or? Okay.
Yeah, I'll read it. Okay, excerpt from the 2017 MCUSA Seeking Peace in Israel and Palestine Resolution.
culminating a 3-year process, delegates at the Mennonite Church USA Assembly in Orlando on Thursday adopted a resolution titled Seeking Peace in Israel and Palestine, with approximately 98% voting in favor. The resolution addresses the injustices of military occupation as well as the suffering caused by anti-Semitism. The resolution notes that the suffering of Palestinians and Jews has too often been set against the other. We recognize, rather, that the legacy of Jewish suffering is intertwined with the suffering of Palestinians.
Next one, read that also. So as you can see from here, the presentation plan today is going to be a baby step towards step. Now before we go any further here, I do want to define a couple of important terms. Some of you probably know these words, some of you might not, but we're going to do it. The first term, as you can see on the screen here, is genocide. As it's listed, it is the intentional destruction of people, whole, or that is. The second term is the Holocaust. The term Holocaust refers to the killing of more than 6 million Jewish across German-occupied Europe during the 1930s and 1940s. There were also many other people targeted for mass killings by the Nazis as well, including queer people, disabled people, Roma people, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, as well as people labeled by the Nazis as asocial, which basically meant anyone they wanted to. The third term is Shoah. Shoah is a Hebrew word that means catastrophe. Many Jewish people prefer the term Shoah to refer to the Holocaust. The reason being that the term Holocaust is a Greek word that refers to a burnt offering to a god. This term was used until the 1940s to refer to many past genocides, but after World War II, it came to be used exclusively for the genocide of the Jewish people by the Nazis. I don't think God wants humans to be sacrificed for any reason to him, so I do not like this term, and I would prefer to use it as the word Shoah. During this presentation, I might be switching between the words Holocaust and Shoah. Holocaust will probably be used in past tense. Thank you. The last term is anti-Semitism. As simplest definition, anti-Semitism is hostility to, prejudice towards, or discrimination against Jews. I should also say a little bit about who the perpetrators of the Shoah were. The main force behind the Shoah were the Nazi government of Germany, but it was aided in this evil by several other forces, including the other nations allied with the Nazis, including Italy and Japan, but other Axis allies, including Romania, Hungary, and Slovakia as well, anti-Semitic people and countries occupied by the German forces who would actively support the Nazis in their attempts at capturing all Jewish people and sending them to concentration camps for forced labor and their eventual deaths. Besides those who actively supported the Nazis in implementing the Shoah were others who simply stood by and allowed this evil to happen. This included the majority of the population in occupied Europe, but also included nations like the United States, who refused admission to most Jewish people fleeing Europe during this era. Thankfully, there were also many who resisted what the Nazis were doing. There are many stories of both violent and non-violent resistance against the Shoah, including especially those in Albania, the only country in Europe to gain a Jewish population during the war years, Denmark, and the Netherlands. In fact, in the Netherlands, we know of at least 40 Mennonites who helped save Jews from the Nazis. Their names are now listed in Israel as among the righteous of all nations. So with this background in place, I want to share a story that helps to explain why education of the Shoah is critically needed and why I wanted to make this presentation. About 2 months ago, I attended an event done by the OCCJ, for those who don't know, the Oklahoma Center for Community Justice, which involved me working with my fellow students to help grow change in our communities via social justice. Out of 50 or so kids in the program, only my friend who I was there with and myself were Jewish. So I had a different perspective from everybody else. We were tasked over our 3 days working together to create a presentation that we would show to a group of our choosing. It was in a small group, sitting around a table, spitballing ideas for presentations and trying to see what would stick or not. And the first thing that came to my mind when I was chosen was, I need to incorporate something Jewish into this, which then made me think about Holocaust education in America.
But when I proposed this idea to my small group, there were a couple of people who didn't know what the Holocaust was. Hearing this confused me, as I thought everyone would know about the Holocaust, since in my opinion it was one of the worst events in human history. But I also knew these kids were sincere. They were telling the truth, and they were brave enough to ask this question, which confirmed to me that they really didn't know what it was. After that, we went back from our small groups to the main group to talk together about how oppression in society could lead to genocide. In that conversation, I again mentioned the story of the Holocaust as one of the many genocides in history. And again, the same thing happened. Many of the students didn't know about the Holocaust, and some of the kids didn't even know who Hitler was. The kids in the program with me were good kids, working to make their communities better and more just. And they were the same age as me too, around 16. I wasn't mad at them for being unaware of this history, but it did convince me that I needed to make Holocaust education the topic of my presentation. Now, I think there are 3 areas that we should be doing Shoah education towards. There are families, schools, and religious communities. Families are extraordinarily important when it comes to education because that is where kids first learn what is important and what their values are. I think many families avoid talking about hard things like the Shoah because it is awkward and hard to talk about, and because parents and guardians are often worried about if it's too horrible or dark for their children to be exposed to. I understand that. But I also worry that too many young people are growing up not knowing anything about it, and that they're not hearing from their adults about why it'd be something important to learn about for our history. My suggestions for families out there is that adults have this responsibility to first educate themselves on these issues, and then to start having age-appropriate conversations starting around elementary school age on this topic. It isn't easy, not at all, but there are good resources out there that can help that we are all going to share at the end of this presentation. You can see right there. The second area is in schools. No matter what kind of a school a student goes to, our time in education shapes who we are, and often is where we first encounter the concept of the broader world. There are many good social studies teachers out there who work hard to ensure that their students learn about events like the Shoah. But teachers also face challenges that make this difficult, including often the lack of resources, as well as not having enough instructional time to cover everything that needs to be covered in the school year. And for some teachers, just like parents, they find the subject dark and awkward and to avoid it, or their districts don't want to talk about it. As members of our community, we should, of course, do all we can to support teachers in this important work, and to encourage teachers that the education about the Shoah is important, and not to get political here, but supporting teachers should affect how we vote and how we engage with our political leaders. If we want to use our voices, we'll need to use them and influence others to make change happen. And by the way, there actually have been some positive moves in this front. Last year, the Oklahoma legislature passed a law that requires education about the Shoah to begin in 6th grade, and for the State Department of Education to work to develop more resources for educators on this topic. This tells me that our legislators do, sometimes, listen to the public and what we need to make our voices heard. And finally, there are churches and other religious communities. These communities have tremendous power because they are webs of social connection between everyone that participates. Religious communities could help to remedy this problem, but too often they just don't. Some religious communities avoid the problem altogether because of blatant anti-Semitism or homophobia, or because they are afraid of delving too deep into painful histories of our past. Mostly, though, I think from all 3 of the categories, ignorance is the biggest problem amongst them. The good news is that many religious communities are stepping up and doing a better job than they had in the past. In preparing for this presentation, I've learned a lot about what the Mennonite Church is doing to better understand their past, both the good and bad parts, and to do better in the future. For anyone, for any group, this is hard work, and it takes time and it takes commitment. And I'm very proud of what you all are doing here. To close today, I did want to talk more about one more thing, and that is what kind of stories we are telling about. Professor author Shostak recently published an article in Humanistic Judaism magazine that argues that we need a major reset in the way that education about the Shoah is done. He argues that for too long, educators have focused solely on what he calls the horror story, with its almost incomprehensible body count and incalculable human tragedy, but have neglected to tell help stories, the stories of ordinary human beings who chose to take nonviolent acts of resistance against the Nazis and their agenda. I'd like to read a few excerpts from this article. To date, jury's 8-decade emphasis has understandably been placed primarily on the Holocaust as a horror story. So as your Heim Genug will never forget having seen What No Man Should Live in, gas chambers built by learned engineers, children poisoned by educated physicians, infants killed by trained nurses, women and children shot and burned by high school and college graduates. Similarly, each of the 46 Holocaust museums around the globe I have visited detail the barbaric manufacture of atrocities, dehumanization, and murder. A visitor, who must be over 13, can see mounds of eyeglasses, human hair, shoes, suitcases, and Nazi taking photos of naked, unburied corpses and emaciated prisoners close to their deaths. Regrettably, horror story centrism leaves out much worth knowing and undermines confidence in human nature and humanity. Rabbi Harold M. Schwartz worries that it can unintentionally translate a corrosive pessimism that has children remembering only the curse of the killers of the dream. The truth is far more complex. To be sure, in her 1997 memoir, Lita Baton Jackson, survivor of several years in Auschwitz-Birkenau, tells many horror stories of gas chambers, shootings, electric fences, torture, scorching sun, mental abuse, and the constant threat of death. However, Livia also tells help stories of faith, hope, triumph, and love. They are stories of perseverance, loyalty, courage, in the face of the overwhelming odds, and of never giving up. Manya Friedman Perel, who survived 6 years and 8 camps, remembers, we resisted in every way we could. Our weapons were our bare hands, our minds, our courage, and our faith. I resisted by stealing bread and potatoes to share with my friends. I resisted by risking my life again and again. The Nazis could not crush our spirit, our faith, or our love for life and humanity. Holocaust nonviolent resistance, which has been called the help story, took many forms, e.g., behind barrack walls, high risk of life, Jewish prisoners secretly taught each other, new arrivals, Zavi boot camp aids for their survival, celebrated birthdays, provided prohibited classes for the children, observed the high holidays, arranged for covert abortions, etc. Out in the open, the old-timers propped up the weaker others, or even traded their jobs to boost the odds of survival. On death marches, some of the weak prisoners dared to try and hold up each other. As such, carers were guided by an ancient tenet, Kol Israel Avrahim Ze Bazeh. We are all responsible for one another as a community. There are many such stories that are waiting to be heard and retold. One of my favorites are the stories told by someone at Temple B'nai Israel in Oklahoma City, Michael Branum. Some of you know him from his work at the Respect Diversity Foundation, but I know him through his teaching of my Sunday school class during the last quarter. His parents were just teenagers in Europe during the Shoah, and their experiences of resistance, survival, and love during these dark days have stuck with me. His parents later had the chance to immigrate to the United States, and they settled in Ponca City, where they ran a small business and rebuilt their lives. But they did more than just survive, because they also taught Michael, who was born here in Oklahoma, their experiences in Europe were in many ways similar to the experiences of the African Americans in segregated Oklahoma in the 1950s, where Michael grew up. Stories like these give me, and many others, a great deal of hope for our future. Mennonites, by their history, are experts in nonviolent resistance. This makes Mennonite congregations perfectly placed to use your voice to amplify these helping stories. I hope these thoughts might inspire you all a little, and I hope we can continue this conversation not just for today, as we are here, but for the future and the future's future. I'm now going to hand it off to my father to continue the discussion part of our discussion.
Thank you so much. So before we jump into discussion, I'll mention this resources page. We just started putting that together. So there's a little bit on there now, but we will have a lot more in the coming days and weeks. And our hope is that it might get shared a little bit broader in the broader Mennonite world, because there's some really important stuff. And we also specifically have a lot about the Mennonite piece of this and history and whatnot. So anyway, I think let's go ahead and move into some conversation and discussion.
Hi, that was just wonderful.
Thank you.
And I'm so excited that you have Michael Kornblum for a teacher and
I know.
mentor. He did school presentations. I don't know if he still does, but
He does. Yeah.
it's just a wonderful presentation. It really is. And his book is so good. It brings out a real unique picture of his family's experiences, and it's just wonderful. And I have it, and I'll be happy to lend it to anybody and pass it around.
But I've known him for a long time, a lot of his presentation. And they've been doing that older life. I mean, they've been giving presentations on what happened to the parents and the struggles over in Germany. That's how they make their living, I think. I don't think he doesn't work. I guess they get fees for giving the talk and everything. It's really interesting and moving.
Mm-hmm. It is. Very glad to have a teacher.
Well, and I really appreciate, that what Mike puts a lot of emphasis on in all of his talks is this concept of helping stories and the idea that it's just too easy to get bogged down in the horror aspect of it and to feel, therefore, powerless. But he does a really great job of showing all of the elements in which people in this terrible, terrible situation found ways to claim their power and found ways to resist and to fight back and to help each other. And when we listen to that aspect of the story, then it allows you to feel like, okay, I could also rise up and I could help other people to rise up. You don't feel as defeated.
I think it really helps to shift the perspective of people. A common thing that I've heard people say is, I am so bothered by the concept of the Shoah, Holocaust, most people would say, that I just can't. Like, I love too much to be able to hear the story, and it's like, well, if you do that, then you erase all of that hope and you erase all of that empowerment, and you have to see both sides of it. But you rob yourself when you try and convince, and also deny your connection to past history. And it's really a disservice when we try and convince ourselves that we're so good at that.
One thing Michael, when he does his press, we went to hear him at the library recently, and in that presentation, he said one of the slogans during World War II was, especially as it became much more clear what was happening in Shoah, was the phrase, never again. And he said the sad thing is that proved to not be true, because he went through, in his presentation, he goes through a slideshow of all the genocides that have happened after that time. And so I think one of the most practical things, and actually I'm impressed, occasionally the Oklahoma legislature stumbles into greatness, occasionally. And last year they kind of did, because one of the things specifically in the new curriculum, and what the statute says is to discuss why, one of the educational goals is to discuss why the Holocaust happened. What were the things that led up to it, and from the standpoint of avoiding other genocides, and that's specifically in the legislation. And that kind of conversation is very important. It's also really hard. It's a challenging conversation. I hope, I don't know, I think Ty would, you can tell me, I think it's pretty accurate. I think for all of us, the message I'm not wanting to say is, oh, teachers aren't doing it. That's not the issue at all. To me, the broader issue is that teachers have been asked to teach on the subject with one hand tied behind their back. That's one of the big problems. And they're not, and it's too often teachers being discouraged from connecting the dots to what happened in history with the present day. And so really what we're arguing for is more supportive teachers to be able to connect the dots.
How old is it?
You think early
But his son, I know that his son is 37th birthday a couple weeks back. So he's old enough to have a 37-year-old son.
I thought he was in his early 70s, maybe.
He's still trucking. He's pretty healthy for a guy his age.
He was born in his I think he was born in his probably late 40s. So.
He was.
His wife is very striking, and an amazing person too. They have sponsored a lot of art events and programs, and that's really a great entree to communicate with people, with kids.
What are some things we can do to fight against anti-Semitism? Because I know last time you said it was on the rise, and I mean, I feel like if you're not in it, you don't really know. And so that was kind of a shock to me. And so I'm just kind of curious what we can do to actively help.
That's a really good question. I wish my voice wasn't nearly as scarred as it is right now. I think just if there are Jewish people in your life, just supporting them right now would be really helpful. It's honestly really hard to get into that conversation because it really ties into what would I want someone to do for me, and I don't know. I really don't.
I think one thing I would say is, in some ways, I think there's similarities between anti-Semitism and homophobia. Because for people that are often prejudiced against gay people or any kind of queer people, often it's not, they haven't had actually very many actual interactions with gay people. Because if they did, that's for me. I was once very homophobic. And for me, what changed my mind on it was encountering so many really cool gay people so I started seeing them differently and realizing, why do I believe this, and this? And, but the first chink in the armor of my homophobia was just getting to know people. So I think one of the challenges, like a place like Oklahoma, is there are not very many Jewish people. And often there are also quite a few Jewish people in Oklahoma who really go out of their way to make sure you never know they're Jewish because they're fearful of it. I know of one kid in Ty's youth group who her dad said, "Don't ever tell anyone at school you're Jewish. Don't ever let it come up." That's really sad to me, and that's not. We have had the opposite approach of being, but it's easy. I guess it's easy as converts to be kind of proud, but I do think the more we can get to know people makes a big difference. And I think another piece of it is just when you hear people saying ignorant things, to engage them in conversation, and especially just if more than anything, just reminding people that get to know some people. You might see it differently if you get to know people.
I mentioned that in my discussion I did about how it was the main problem about discussing the Shoah in education and familiar places and in places like this, religious institutions. I mentioned that it was mainly ignorance that was the hardest part. And again, that's why if you know any Jewish people, talk to them, be their friends, because you'll know a lot more from discussing with them than we did beforehand. And to be honest, I think we all want to be your friends. I haven't met a single one that doesn't.
I think that's why one of the reasons why Ty decided to, try to intentionally use the word Shoah is that language makes a big difference. And so when you're constantly talking about this catastrophe using a phrase that at its basis is anti-Semitic, equating the death of humans to a sacrifice to God is pretty problematic, And so even just making small changes of starting to say, instead of saying Holocaust, maybe I'm going to try to make the effort to start saying Shoah, just to twist the conversation. And if somebody asks you, why did you say that? Oh, well, I know why I'm choosing that word differently. And so it can maybe twist the conversation in a different path. But I also think that what we're seeing also is there's a lot of neighborhoods right now that are getting flyers left out that are having anti-Semitic things on them. People are getting things put in their mailboxes. Rocks are being put on the ground, weighing down these bags of signs that are full of anti-Semitic tropes and statements. If you see something like that, immediately take a picture and then try to get it out of people's view and call the police. That's what they're asking.
That and the
to do,
Jewish called the Jewish Federation,
Mhm.
just to let them know.
Yeah.
I will tell you, for the most part, they're trying not to, when people find things like this, and it happens pretty often, they're trying to not post the stuff on social media. Tell about
Yeah.
it, yes, they saw it, but not to say what
Yeah,
it
take
is.
the picture to show to the police. Don't take the picture to post it.
But really, and I'll mention legally, the reason church police is not, that's against law, because it's not. People can leave hate literature in America anywhere they want. But it's if there's later a crime against someone, a Jewish person in the area, it would be evidence that connecting the two. But unfortunately, in this country, sharing hate literature is in most contexts legal. So that's one of the challenges.
And most of this, what's going around right now, most of it is basically playing on these really basic anti-Semitic tropes. And I think when people start to research and understand what a trope is and what these basic tropes are, then you can start to see them and spot them more easily. And it's more easy to start to say, oh, wait a second, yeah, I've heard that before, that's not. And so a lot of the tropes are that there's these ideas that people believe that there's somehow a group of Jewish people who have undue power in the world and are like the Illuminati. They're controlling things, and this is where the idea of Jewish space lasers come in, and there are honestly people who believe that somehow the U.S. government and Hollywood and the national banking system are all being controlled by Jews. Well,
George Soros.
Jews represent about 0.02% of the population of Earth, and it's number one, it just isn't realistic. But history shows that this is not a new trope. This has been going back for 1,000 years at least, connecting the idea of Jews with this kind of money and power, secret money and power. And that comes from way back in time, around 1,000 years ago, when a lot of the different inquisitions happened in Europe. And when that happened, basically Jews were not allowed to own property, they weren't allowed to own fields or work in labor, they couldn't get jobs, and so all they could do was things that Christians didn't want to do. Well, what was one of the things that Christians weren't allowed to do at the time? Christians weren't allowed to do banking or to do money and loaning, because at that point in time, people took the scriptures very, very seriously when they talk about Christians and money issues. Nowadays, people don't take those issues seriously, but they did back then. And so at that point, then, all that Jews maybe had an opportunity in the community was maybe to work as lenders or to work with money. And so because of that, then Christians often became very jealous and became very frustrated, saying, well, wait a second, why do they have the money? Well, they have the money because you didn't let them have a land or farm. They couldn't own their house. They couldn't do it. This is the only thing you let them do. And so that trope is carried forward. There's also been a trope called blood libel. And blood libel is this idea that Jews somehow participate in murdering children. And so that's coming up on all these flyers that are being put out. And so there are these tropes related to Jews and this is where when the guy went in and shot up the pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. because he thought that there were secretly Jews who were trafficking children in this pizza parlor. And so he went in with a gun because this is being spread about now that the internet can get spread really easily. It can get spread about. And so there that kind of imagery, that kind of tropes of connecting Jewish people with human trafficking or child abuse or.
So is it similar to like systematic racism? There's a lot of things as a white person you don't realize is there, and you kind of have to educate yourself. Is there a lot of systematic anti-Semitism as well?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. But when you start to study it and see it, you can see it more easily, and then it's easier to kind of know when somebody makes some kind of joke or kind of, oh, wait a second, that's not so funny.
Recently, I just happened to stumble on two YouTube people talking that were U.S. legislators. One was Marjorie Taylor Greene, and another one was an unfamiliar to me, and I don't remember the name, who were using the term, "we will not be replaced." And that goes right back to Hitler's fascism. I think they were addressing it to immigrants and, illegals. But when those kind of things start to just creep into big shots speeches and nobody sees a red flag, that's really scary.
Terrifying.
Well, I think that unfortunately, I think it's destined to get worse rather than better because of things that are happening. Basically, it's this, when you have a weird clash of religion and science, that's what created the Nazis. Was this clash of religion and science. So you had a Christian-based society who had a belief that they were somehow more pure in thought, in spirit, they were better and elevated than everybody else who wasn't a Christian. And you had science coming along and telling them that basically evolution had selected against various people. So it was the discovery of Neanderthals in Germany and Austria that really led towards this upswing in evolutionary humanism, essentially. And so they came to see that, there were groups of people who went extinct. There were groups of people that got selected against because they weren't strong enough. They weren't pure enough. They weren't good enough. And if they started to look around them and say, okay, who are the weak links here? We can't let people marry them. We have to stay apart. And in fact, we can't let our resources even go to these people because if we don't, we're all going to go extinct as a human society. We're poised with AI and with genetic engineering and with all of these things that are happening. We're poised in the sense that we could have clashes like this again. And if we don't have religious people stepping up and saying, no, we're not going to let our religion be hijacked. We're not going to let our religion be taken for this ride. Then we could be seeing people saying, okay, well, no, some people are genetically more inferior. Some people are, culturally more inferior. And therefore, they don't deserve the resources and they don't deserve the help and they don't deserve to have a place in this society. And I think that, now is the time for everybody who can understand history to say, hey, wait a second, things go bad when we let this narrative get out of control.
What is the appropriate way for either an educator or just someone on social media being involved in a discussion that includes a conversation around the swastika? Like, what is there ever an appropriate way to include that imagery, either in a classroom or on social media?
That's a great question.
I think on social media, I don't see any way it can be used. In a classroom, I could see potentially a historic picture from that time period being that I would avoid using the symbol by itself. That's what I would say. I would say I think that students do need to know that there was visual imagery and that visual imagery was part of. Think about. I just used it to say it like this. There's a reason why Coca-Cola is so well known. They have a catchy logo, symbols of movements like that. So people need to know that, but I think keeping it from becoming an isolated, in other words, putting it in that historic context, like historic photos, I think is one thing. I personally would, in most cases, avoid it altogether on social media, just because there's the context. You can't give the context, and there's so many ways it can be misused. But it's tricky, obviously.
And talking about that discussion, most neo-Nazis nowadays don't really use the swastika. There's dozens and dozens of replacement symbols that they have that all mean the exact same thing. I am Nazi. But there are so many of them, and most of them are extraordinarily different, and you might have walked past someone who had one of them. on a tattoo or on a shirt. That's how easy it is now.
Oh yeah.
We were driving back from Missouri yesterday and saw multiple on vehicles as we drove past. And, you know, and I'm not educating all of them, but he knows all of them. And he could point them out and go, oh, yep, that means that person is, you know, proud boy, and then, you know, they're following this fascist ideology, and they're, I've never run social media anymore, so I can't keep up.
By the way, the one thing along these lines that I really highly recommend in Tulsa is the Sherwin Miller Museum of Jewish Art. Fantastic museum, but one of the things that they have traveling exhibits. There's so much good stuff happening there. But one of the things that they have an exhibit all about the Holocaust, the Shoah. And in there, one of the most arresting images Ty and I saw when we toured it recently. If I remember right, they had a picture of, they're trying to show basically how clothing and things like that are used by hate groups. And so the first image was of a Klansman in the row. And there are pictures behind them tying it to the Tulsa race riots, putting it in that context. Next was a Nazi uniform, and there are pictures behind putting that context. And then there was, the third mannequin was the Proud Boy uniform, polo shirt, their whole outfit. And then behind the pictures of them, you know, the torches and whatnot. And they're making the point that this is the same thing. These are hate groups that are, and they're using imagery and uniforms and things like that to form group cohesion and also to send the message of who's in and who's out. And to me, that was very helpful. I was really impressed. They called it like it was, of connecting those dots. And so I think that's a really important piece. By the way, one thing that I also wanted to mention in this conversation, and specifically is because of that Mennonite resolution from 2017, a little bit of the backstory of that resolution. A few years before, there was a motion calling for the Mennonite Church to participate in the BDS, Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign in support of Palestinians, so urging people to not invest in Israeli companies. And at the time, when it first got discussed, there was a lot of conversation about, is this the right thing to pass? At the time, the discussion was, we haven't had enough conversations with the Jewish community. That was really the take-home message in 2015. So by 2017, there was a lot more conversations, and what really came clear was that the suffering and the oppression of Palestinians is in many ways intertwined with the historic suffering of Jewish people, and so you have to work through both of those things together. And so one of the reasons I bring that up is often there's a lot of controversy among many people about the BDS campaigns and whatnot. And I'll just give you from a Jewish perspective, I think one of the things to kind of bear in mind in that conversation is that there are many Jewish people, particularly in the United States, liberal Jews, who also are very supportive of Palestinian rights, but they are also very protective of the idea of Israel as a Jewish homeland. And so it gets complicated and messy. What I'm really proud of the Mennonite Church in that resolution was just saying, we're going to be in conversation. And so I think because of that now, there are doors opened that previously weren't opened. Before, there were some Jewish communities who were nervous to talk to Mennonites because of the 2015 discussion and some mischaracterizing, in my opinion, of that discussion, of framing it not in a helpful way. But I think because of that 2017 resolution, which made it really clear that the Mennonite tradition supports Jewish people as other oppressed peoples, and we want to understand the history, we want to work to combat oppression today, but we also are dealing with this other kind of oppression, and we're working at both together. And so one of the things also along these lines, many state governments are passing laws that are penalizing people participating in BDS campaigns. And one very important thing to remember to hear about that is that Jewish people are not the ones pushing for these laws. The Reform movement of Judaism, that's where our temple is a part of, they have a statement against those kind of laws. And the Reform movement is against BDS. They say as a movement, we don't think you should BDS, but we also don't think the laws of the U.S. should penalize people for it. And that's my own belief about BDS is I boycott anything associated with the occupation, military contractors, or any company that's using that's located in illegal settlements. But I don't boycott all Israeli things. And I think there's a lot of Jewish people that are So I just bring this up. I know this is a tension. There's always a lot of tension for Mennonites. Is the priority being peacemaking and justice in all ways. And so I wanted to kind of clue y'all in a little bit of some of the nuance of discussion. But also, there's also obviously some emotions. It's hard stuff.
One of the quotes you had in your presentation reminded me, it was toward the end, when you were reading the excerpt, that was about community and I can't remember right now how it went, but it reminded
We're all responsible for each other.
Yeah. It reminded me of when the kids were at Edgemere, they're kind of like, I don't know if the kids knew this specifically, but the teachers and the administration had this idea of using that phrase, like, I am because you are, and trying to help the kids learn, like, the way other people feel matters, including people matters, that, they didn't go into it this much, but that there's, like, an interconnectedness between humans, right, and that, like, who I am is somehow connected to, like, who you are, and, I appreciate that, like, that sentiment, and I think it has helped me as an adult kind of navigate this, like, learning about a lot of things I didn't learn as a young person, and trying to work through, like, trying to not villainize people for making bad choices, even, like, the most horrendous, like, that somehow, like, like, my humanity is still bound up in those people's too, and so this, like, idea that engaging people when they say, ignorant things or hateful things, that, like, villainizing them doesn't help them, and it doesn't help me, and I know, like, we all have different degrees in which we can, like, engage in that, but, I think, this idea that, like, when we start putting some people on the outside and some people on the inside, however people do that in their lives, it opens the door for, mistreatment, and we see it, in so many different ways. But, I think with my kids, I often try to, like, have conversations in ways of, like, no one's, like, I hate saying no one, but I would like to believe no one is a bad person, right? People have learned bad things, and they've been taught bad things, and hurtful things, and that has to be, like, that can't be excused or dismissed, but, like, you also can't write people off if it is true that, I am because you are, and then, so that idea of, like, we're responsible for each other within, like, our small communities, but I think, like, as a whole. And so I appreciate you bringing that idea, because it's a good reminder for me just in my everyday life, like, just in how I think about situations. So.
Thank you.
I think that what that makes me think of is, I think that the concept, this is why education about the Shoah is important, because this is not that long ago, like, as of 2 years ago, I still had grandparents alive who, were in Europe fighting in World War II. There are so many people still alive who this was their lived experience, and therefore, you have so many more people who are the generation after that, like Mike Kornblit, who was the product of parents who this was their lived experience, and you have people, our age being maybe grandchildren of the people that this was their lived experience. And so when we talk about, intergenerational trauma, then the Shoah is really a part of that. And so I don't think that you can even begin to have a conversation about what's going on, like, right now in Israel and Palestine, if you don't have a conversation about how that directly relates to this catastrophe that happens and how that intergenerational trauma plays out. And so there are going to be people who are, going to be much more concerned about the land of Israel and what having that land to them means to them. And there's going to be people who are going to be very concerned about the nation of Israel and what that nation might mean to them in terms of some potential safe haven or, some security, something that it was offered to, my relative only was alive because this land, And so when you meet and interact with lots of those people, then I think it forces me to have to become a lot more compassionate about seeing that there are so many different viewpoints and the problems are so complex and they're never going to be black and white. And so how can you have sympathy for this generational trauma banging its head against this other community's people generational trauma, and so you have a land that's full of traumatized people, and therefore the whole world says, I don't know what to do with this, and a lot of times then it's easier to think, well, I'll just stop, or I'll say, well, you're right and you're wrong, and that's the way, and I, washing my hands of this deal, and to really dig into the story and the complexity of all of it and how this worldwide catastrophe is still playing out. We're not 100 years later. It's still playing out. I think it just gives you a greater sense of compassion for other human beings.
Well, related to that interconnected generational trauma, I find it interesting that the Palestinian word for their dispossession, their losing of their land, is the Nakba, which is also another word for, in their language, for catastrophe. So both of these communities are seeing their traumas through that catastrophic lens, and so to me that's a way of connecting to their suffering and of continuing to be present in the fact that this is not a simple issue at all. But if we keep coming back to compassion, to me that's a starting point. I don't know what the ending point is, but I know that the starting point has to be compassion.
There's going to be, through the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, a seminar on mass trauma. So that's going to be interesting to find out the how that's been taking place here in Oklahoma, let alone the nation, and that includes Jewish people too. So yeah.
When is that?
I think another thing of going back to your question about, anti-Semitism is also, having an understanding that, that there's a saying in the Jewish community that if you have two Jews, you will have at least three opinions. And so the idea that not everybody is going to be the same. And so, and I come to deeply understand and appreciate that the more and more Jewish people that we are involved with and the more deeply connected that we are to understanding that, not everybody reacts to trauma the same. Not everybody reacts to the history of their family or their community or their religion the same. And so when people can have a deeper understanding of that too, and you start to realize that Jews are not all identical, they're not all homogenous, they're everyone is completely unique in their own view of what they view their religion and what they view their relationship to God and what they view their relationship to their community and to their nation and to everything. I think that really helps too to realize.
So can I ask, it may be an ignorant question, but okay, is it Judaism? Because I've always thought of it in like two parts: the religion and then like So is it both, or is it like a mixture, or?
Yeah, all of the above.
Okay.
Is it?
Sorry.
You know,
That was a good question.
yeah, it's a fantastic question, and if you ask that to the Jews, then that would start off a day-long debate.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of
I
opinions.
mean, everybody would
That's
have
not a
their own
joke.
opinion.
That's literally true.
But what you at least have to say is that that word, just that word, Jewish, you know, comprises both, you know, peoples in terms of communities and in terms of a religion and in terms of a, you know, a nation as part of the, you know, United Nations and a land as a parcel or a piece of the face of the earth, as well as a culture and a history. And yeah, it's not any one thing. And so somebody could be Jewish and they could choose to connect to all of that, whatever way they want to connect to. And they might say, well, I'm Jewish because I have some DNA and I choose to participate in eating Jewish foods. And that's my aspect of the culture, but I'm not going to do anything else. And then you might have other people who might say, well, I'm going to be deeply imbued in this as a religion, but I'm not going to consider it my culture or my nation. I have no need to go to the land of Israel and be a part of that community, but I'm going to be deeply immersed in this Torah study as my religion. Or you could have somebody else who says, I see this very deeply as a nationality to me, and it doesn't have anything to do with religion for them. But it's almost like somebody saying, well, I'm an Oklahoman, you know? And how many different Oklahomans are they? And to say I'm an Oklahoman means something different to every one of us.
A little bit in Canada, it's interesting. Someone's Mennonite identity works a little bit like this in Canada. I've met people in Canada who are not religiously Mennonite, but they have this Mennonite heritage. And so they love Mennonite foods, they love Mennonite crafts, they identify in that way. They don't go to church. Church isn't their thing. That concept hadn't been taken off in the U.S., but in Canada that is present. So I think there are actually a lot of interesting similarities between the Mennonites and the Jewish communities. And,
Okay. Sorry, Jeff.
oh, it's fine.
I don't want to put pressure on anyone, but I'm going to create some space. Ty is 16. We've got 5 folks in here who are a lot closer to a presenter's age than all the rest of us. So are there any reflections and or questions from the young people?
Do they know what the Holocaust is? Have you had it in school or?
Not in school.
I think Duke did a really good job of like talking to us like multiple years out of our like middle school and high school education about it, and we did like
That's good.
we've done presentations about different aspects of it, and just have had like a week or two out of a couple of years to learn about it. But
We talked about it in my social studies class.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, thank you. Awesome.
I am very worried that we are experiencing a desensitization right now in Oklahoma towards the queer community, in particular towards trans people. Like, that might mirror what was happening in the decade leading up to the Shoah.
Clash of religion and science.
Right.
Except it's ag religion and bets.
Yeah, yeah. But the combination of the two can be toxic and dangerous.
Well, and I think too, like as we try to raise more awareness and more inclusion and more just, education about the LGBTQ plus community, there are people that are like, no, you're shoving it in our face, blah, blah, blah. And so we take one step forward and then we're pushed 2 steps backwards. And so, what he's talking about, I can see that very much so.
Yeah, I have a lot of alarms when people say things like, well, it could be worse, or, or some sort of appeal to the past or the future. It's like, we need to stay focused on
now.
Yeah.
When I read about people who stuck their necks out to help Jews in the most extreme situations in Europe, I mean, you just can't help but wonder if you would be up to that moral challenge yourself if it came to you. And, you know, some of that is maybe being over dramatic and trying to put yourself in the center of this interesting picture, but actually it happened fast. I mean, it went from subtle pressure and minor political restrictions to total clampdown so fast. If you just count the months and years that it happened, not just in Germany, but in other European countries that caved. And it does seem like, you know, we should, I don't know exactly how, but it seems like we should prepare ourselves.
Well, we have an example. That's the good news. Very much recently, in the 1980s, when so many of the Central American refugees were coming, there was this massive solidarity movement. And in Oklahoma, people like Moses and Sadie and Art and Marianne Mertens and that whole network of people were involved in that. And it's long enough now we can talk about it because statute of limitations is up. But they were literally hiding people and making arrangements to get them to Canada because they couldn't. The Reagan administration was so hostile towards them being able to have status here, but their lives were not safe in Central America, and we're actively involved in that. And the beautiful thing about it was these sweet little old people. You'd never think that these are, smugglers. They could do it, and so I would argue that we need to be talking to the last of that generation, find out how they did it. What that looked like because they saved a lot of lives and it's an example for us. I mean, obviously it wasn't quite as high stakes, but if they had been caught, they would have gone to prison.
Well, and they weren't fellow citizens like the European Jews were. I mean, they had their established, they thought, rights just removed.
I think it starts off small too, though. Like what you were saying, sticking up for people, even in just conversation. If you're somebody that's just willing to sit by while somebody says homophobic, anti-Semitic, racist things, and you're just like, it ain't about me, I don't have to worry about it, then, you would probably be somebody that's like, I'm not going to get arrested for this. It starts off really small. And so if you can stick up for somebody, maybe you can take those gradual steps. Because if you stick up for someone, maybe you won't have to hide someone.
Mm-hmm. Okay. A call toward the end of our discussion. We're actually doing pretty good on time, but especially for new voices.
I'm a new voice. I've spoken.
Yeah. I just recommend something I read in college. I brought it up before, but Viktor Frankl's *Man's Search for Meaning* was like a really pivotal book for me. It's like humanistic psychology. Like logotherapy, this idea that people with something to live for like can flourish, and trying to connect with people. I don't remember all the ideas. It makes me want to go back and read it. I just remember it being really powerful.
I have that book on Audible, and I listened to it a little while ago, and basically the essence that he talks about is you can't take away nothing except the person's attitude. That's what he stressed.
He was a survivor.
Yes.
Thank you for mentioning us on Audible. I'm getting it right now.
Oh, okay.
Just again, Ty, I want to say thank you. I can't remember the last time someone got applause. That's pretty cool.
Thank you. Well, and I have to one thing I have to brag on this congregation that a big part of Utah is that y'all planted seeds that the old saying, one person waters, one person plants, another person waters, that y'all had a role in Ty's becoming the awesome person he is. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
He's an awesome person.
Start thinking about part 2.
I'm an awesome person.
Yeah, okay.
All right, I think we're ready for joys and concerns.